This is the last painting I did. And what we're going to focus on is laying in a very light, warm wash to capture the kind of furry top coats. And we'll bring it right on down into the full body. And then later we will come back in and we'll actually darken and tuck in behind some of this lighter sunlit fur from above to create our negative shapes and define the negative shapes of the really shaggy, kind of gnarly type coat that they have that's indicative of their their protection when they're out in the elements. Something that kind of, as I was studying these Highlander cattle, their coats kind of remind me a little bit of the American bison. You get really a lot of excess fur and stuff to protect them from the winter elements, and working with a negative shape and pushing our darks up in to define the jagged edge, and then getting the shadowed darks down underneath their bellies is what really makes this top coat pop. And the other thing that makes it pop is coming in with a very dark background. And this is what I was talking about before. I don't really want the viewer to be distracted by something in the far background. But what I want to use it as is an element to make this negative shape come forward and be more important and be brighter by putting a cool dark behind it. The cool recedes. The dark makes this negative shape pop. And then we have a warm dark that's underneath the belly and on the forehead, the throats, and the forearms, or forelegs, anchors the cattle. And then we will hopefully not forget to put a little bit of shadow underneath these cattle in the grass. And this is a pretty loose interpretation. There's no real secret to this. It's just anchoring them to the vegetation and the terrain. Their legs and their hooves are down in the grass, so we don't really see those. So that gives you a little bit of explanation. I'll move this out of the way. Here's just one real quick recap. This is the photo I'm using. And as you look at my drawing, hopefully you can see some of it. I actually did get the whole scale and proportion of the cattle in this one so that you could see that they have sort of an elongated body. Now, the one thing that kind of a symbol or a mark or a gesture that you get with most cattle is they have this real boxy square shape. And then their legs come back behind their throat and their neck. So if you're doing cattle off in the distance in a landscape, it's always good to remember that cattle visually, as you look at them across in the distance, you see these little squares or kind of rectangles, and that's kind of their shape, and it's very pronounced. If you look at the photo reference, you can see how long and rectangular their body shape is. But you can definitely see a light source that comes in from above. The underside is in shadow. The warmth of the cattle makes them come forward in the painting. The coolness of a background that we're going to select is going to push the background behind them to really make the cattle feel like they're closer to us, and the background recedes. So getting started, I want to wet this a little bit. And so I'm just going to take a misting bottle and just kind of mist this area where the cattle are, just so that it's a little bit damp. And then I'll take just a small flat, and I'm going to mix up some yellow ochre. You can see over here, I'm just mixing up a little bit of a wet mixture. It's I don't want to get this too heavy, so I'll add a little bit of water to the mixture, get it worked into my brush really well, and then come back to the cattle and just start kind of working down over their shape, their ears, their nose. We're kind of eliminating the white of the paper where their body parts are. Leave their nose kind of untreated because they have a distinctive other colors for their nose. But this is an underpainting. We're not trying to do anything real detailed here. We're just laying in fairly damp paper, not real wet, but just damp enough to take the tint of this wet and wet approach and I have my board slightly elevated. I have a magic eraser underneath it, which is like a foam sponge. And it's just enough to give my board a little elevation so that all of the pigment runs downhill and it just keeps moving across the surface of the cattle. I'm just covering everything. And as this starts to dry, we'll cut back in and get the darks in there. But we've got to get the initial, just very light beige, kind of a, I'm using yellow ochre, if I forgot to tell you. Raw sienna also works pretty well if you don't have yellow ochre. But you can see now very quickly, I've just basically kind of blocked in. One of the things I tried to do is give a little bit of a variation to the top of his back along his spine so that it isn't such a long, uninterrupted straight line. I think if you looked at one of my paintings, the first painting I did, here's a picture of it. This is really too rigid. And what I had gone back, because a lot of the background bled into the cattle's coat that was supposed to be light, I took a magic eraser and lifted that, but I realized that I don't like that because it draws too much attention to that edge. Whereas if we can kind of break up the linear aspect of his back, it feels more natural. Anyway, we'll let that kind of settle for a minute. A lot of my water is running downhill. It's collecting where it hits dry paper at the bottom of his feet and legs. And so sometime at this point, just wipe your brush clean and just wick up some of that excess puddle so that it just kind of manages that water a little bit. And that way it'll dry a little bit quicker for you. So we'll let you get that all done. I think everybody should have moved through this fairly quickly. There's not a lot of detail involved. So, but what we're doing is we're laying down the lightest value on this, and I'm purposely going to leave the horns completely dry and white, the white of the paper. They'll be a negative shape. So be sure you kind of protect that. As the water continues to flow downhill, just come back in and wick up some of that excess puddle or pool of water in the points where it collects. Even if you take a tissue, sometimes that might help with the drying process, because we don't really need to have a lot of excess water to spread around our detail there at that point. All right, at this point, I'm just going to probably lay in our foreground as well. So going back to our photo, we've got a little bit of green in there, but it's also very similar to the color we're using for the lightest value on the cattle. I am going to pick up a little bit of the new gamboge, which is kind of like an Indian yellow. It's a warm yellow, just to add to that yellow ochre. It's got a slight bit of orange to the cast to the yellow. You add a little bit of the yellow ochre to that, come back. And I've got some rocks over here. I'll go in and just on dry paper, just drop in some warmth there. I'm going to pick up a little bit of raw umber, fairly dry amount on my brush, and just drop in just some darks in that. And it's already wet, so it just kind of diffuses and dilutes and moves around within that. But it gives me a little bit of dark next to that gamboge and yellow ochre. Now, as far as the rest of the foreground, I'm going to pick up some leaf green, mix it with a little bit of the raw umber, and I'm just going to kind of come in here very loosely with my brush and just drop in some color. Then I'll come back in with some of the yellow ochre that's mixed up already in my palette, and let it kind of flow across some of those areas that have a little bit of the raw umber leaf green mixture. As I get closer down here into the foreground, I'm going to use a little bit more stronger brush marks, and then maybe pick up a little bit of the cobalt teal light, which just is a very light blue-green cast. And then I'm just going back and forth with my brush, getting different colors in here just to try to fill in a very light value for my my foreground. Now, as you get closer to the bottom of the page, I'm using more sedimentary colors like this raw umber in a drier application. I'm blotting a lot of the water off of my brush and going in and just tapping the damp brush into the pigment so that I can get some marks in here that don't dilute and don't spread. They just kind of sit there on the paper. I can also do the same thing with a little bit of ultramarine, not getting it real wet, a fairly dry application on my brush, and drop a little bit of this in here around the bottom of their legs, and then come back with some raw umber and just kind of drop that in there. And then I'll take my misting bottle and just give it a half squirt, and it just takes those marks and just kind of smooths them out and lifts a little bit of the water up off the paper and lets it blend naturally with the other adjacent marks. I'm going to also take a fairly dry bristle brush here and I can just kind of soften and move some of this color around and just create a really nice soft foreground without much effort. It just softens it, and I can always come back in and pick up a little bit more paint. And I want to get a little bit of that ultramarine and a little bit of raw umber and come in right behind and around their kind of his feet to suggest a shadow in the grass without actually putting any hard marks in there. And then just let that kind of sit there. And it's a very soft mark, and yet it has a kind of a feeling that it's vegetation. If you want, you can always take a little bit of raw umber, or I'm sorry, raw burnt sienna rather, and do the same thing. Dry your blending brush and just kind of soften it a little. I like that. That works pretty well. I'm going to pick up a little bit of quinacridone burnt orange, or maybe even a little bit of orange, and get down here in the corner. And I'll end up bringing some reeds of cattails or grass or something up across those rocks later. But for now, we've basically laid in the lightest value of their top coats, the furry, bushy head what do you call it? The headdress that they've got on them, and we're ready to pretty much come in now. And I would suggest while we let this dry, we start working on our background. So let's talk a little bit about what we would use for the background. I'm going to leave the area that runs right between and behind them where the pond is just dry, because I want to give the cattle a chance to dry. But we can definitely come in around the top and behind the cattle with the cool. I would like, in my thinking about laying this out, I want to go from a very dark cool over on the left, and as the eye moves across that shape, it gradually gets a little bit lighter in value and a little bit warmer. It still will have a kind of a blue-green background, but we'll go from a very cool dark to a medium dark cool over on the right. And that'll give us a little bit of movement across. What it'll also do is it'll put our darkest darks right behind the horns, which will be our lightest lights. And of course, that creates value contrast. And the value contrast is what draws our viewers' attention, and that puts their heads right in the center of interest. So to get going with this, I'm going to just mix up, I'll bring this over here to my palette, some royal blue that I love in lieu of some of the other options like Windsor blue or phthalo blue or Indrothene or Prussian blue. Those are all really, really dark blues. The ultramarine is a little warmer blue. It's not quite as deep and dark. Ultramarine is also a sedimentary color, whereas the royal blue, Prussian blue, Windsor blue, phthalo blue, all in that value area, are all staining transparent colors. So they will allow us to go much, much darker. So I'm going to add a little bit of raw umber to this, and then a little bit of either Viridian or Hooker's green, something that's a real staining green, that's a true green. And it just gives that blue more of a green cast, but it stays in the dark blue neighborhood. All right, coming back to our painting, I'm going to work in around the horns so I can control that shape. And I did a fairly tight job of drawing those horns out so that I was sure to be able to preserve and protect the shape of those horns. I don't want to get too close to the ears because that's all going to be very wet and soft, but I'm going to just keep bringing this across and keep it dark. I'm going to add more water. I will actually add deeper parts of blue in here next to the greens. Because it's wet, my brush is really wet, I'm able to move this across the dry paper and create little areas here that are maybe not getting completely covered, and that's okay. That'll create little interesting areas that later will get glazed over, but we'll still see them. Now, as I get closer to this other calf, I want to get a little darker down by the right above his head. I don't know if you can see it. Is my hand covering anything up? Went too far. You can always take a clean brush if you go too far, and you can always push some of this paint away, take a tissue and fix it if you get a little bit out of line there. Now that I've got all that in there, I'm going to add a little bit of orange. I use transparent orange by Schminke. It's a staining color, but you add that with some more of the dark blue, the royal blue that I like, and you really get a nice rich dark. And this is all wet, so this dark just kind of takes over and flows and mingles and mixes with these other colors. I'm going to take a little bit of sap green, see what happens there with that, and possibly a little gamboge. We'll try that, see what happens. No, I don't want that. The raw umber is a sedimentary color, and it should provide a little granulation in this background. But I really like how dark this is going on this one side. Hopefully, we will keep moving across here so that this doesn't have a chance to dry. And I'm just going to work along the edge of that horn. I've got it sketched out. And then I'll just come back in with some more of that Hooker's green, a little bit of raw umber, and just drop that in there. Oh, look what I did. We all do this, not to worry. Okay, as we come across, I'm going to take the little sponge that's underneath my painting and take it out so that this water, this blue that was running downhill and then collecting across the top of his horns, can be spread back into the background a little bit more. I'm going to also take some of that royal blue, mix it up in my palette. Got a nice big dark mixture here. And I'm using either cobalt turquoise light or Holbein's horizon blue. It's like you can see it's like a teal color. You mix them together and you get kind of a silvery color. And so coming back, I'm going to add a little bit of that in there, see what happens just in a few spots, because I want this background to be very mottled and have a lot of variety to it. I'm going to get the point of his horns a little better defined, and then go back in and add a little bit more of the gold tone that you get with raw umber into this wet area so that it feels like it's got some movement.
Randy, what color instead of royal blue can they use?
There's several colors: Prussian blue, Ingerthine blue, Windsor blue from Winsor Newton or phthalo blue. They're basically the same color. They're both, all of them are very staining colors, and they will take you down to a really instantaneous dark. And you mix a little bit of green with those, and you get a beautiful kind of background, cool background color. So you can see now, as I pull the wet brush across this shape, it's pulling this color, and it's getting, because I'm just taking a damp brush that's wet and moving it across, it's pulling a lot of the pigment that was already there, and it's diluting it, and it's getting lighter and lighter as it moves from left to right. And as I come across the back of his spine here, I'm defining that with darks. I'm going to actually put my little sponge back underneath my board so it has a little bit of elevation, and go back in now and get some darks right behind his backbone in a couple spots, just to really make sure that that is defined. Get more of that raw umber in there. It warms it up a little bit. But you can, I don't know if you can tell, but there's a lot of water on here. It's just very, very big puddles of water that are moving that pigment across his back to his tailbone and then down behind. And we'll just kind of move that in behind him, defining the tail a little bit. I'm going to get a dark right in there. There's a little gap in there. But this is does a nice job, especially when I put the raw umber in there, which is a sedimentary color, and it will be less staining and give me more texture as it starts to dry. Going back over here to the other side, you got to always be cognizant of how quickly things are drying. This is drying and it's leaving a gap. So I want to get my darks and mix a little bit of that blue, that dark blue, with the raw umber, and come back in and really define the points of the horn there, just to make sure it stays nice and dark. Now, setting my brush down for a moment. Let's see, we've got a shoreline that comes across here. I don't want to take my dark any lower than that shoreline. So we'll just leave that where it is. And I will take a synthetic round. This round has no paint on it. And I want it to be just slightly damp. And I'm going to come back in and tickle the edge where the ears meet that dark background color. So it just softens it a little bit. I can actually even bring in some dark and drop it in a couple places. It's a little drier than the paint that's on there. And that gives me a soft, furry edge to those ears. While that's sitting there dark, I'm rinsing my brush really well, getting all the pigment off of it. And I just have a little bit of water on the edge of this tip of this brush. And I'm just dropping a tip of clean water right into the edge of those ears. And what'll happen, it won't happen instantaneously, is gradually that water that I just dropped on there will start eroding into the dark pigment and create a bloom that really is kind of special. And if I can take a little drier dark pigment, this is the dry royal blue and the raw umber, and come in on the other side, right next to where I dropped that water in there, that dark is going to react with that water, and you're going to get a nice kind of a cauliflowery type fuzzy effect. You kind of have to play with this a little bit. Sometimes you put a little bit more water in if it needs it, and you can't really see it, what it's going to do instantaneously. It takes about five or 6 minutes for this to actually do its thing. And I'm going to dry the backside of that white just a little bit and let the water that's in next to that really dark pigment just react. And it's going to get real fuzzy looking and be real interesting. And it's the water reacting with the dark pigment. Do a little bit of that in a couple places across his back. Just drop in a little bit of water, and all of a sudden you're going to get some blooms that occur. Once this dries, I'm going to soften and break up that hard line across his back. I'm going to get a little dark in here behind his tail. We'll get some more raw umber back in here. This is still really, really wet back in here, which is nice. And this will dry very light because it's mostly sedimentary pigment. But I can also take a rigger at this point. Here's a little rigger I'm using. It's long, skinny brush. Get a little bit of water on there, and I can just sprinkle a little bit of water into this wet background. And it's going to give some textures to that background, break it up, make it less definable. It just becomes a backdrop that really sets off the cattle. So at this point, I think I'm going to let you keep working on this. I want to let mine dry. I'm going to take some tissue around the edge and wick up any excess water that's kind of spilled into the taped border of my paper, so that it doesn't, create a bloom around the edges. And we'll just kind of watch this, let it dry. I've got a heat gun that doesn't make much noise, and I'll use this to kind of accelerate some of the drying process. But you can see that it's creating a lot of variety of lights and darks within this dark, cool background. And that's pretty exciting to see that when you realize it's just a backdrop to highlight the cattle. And I'm always watching this thing. I think everybody probably, hopefully, spends more time watching their painting than actually painting, because that's when we see things happen. And it gives us a chance to kind of think through what we're going to do next. And you should always be taking an opportunity to just kind of watch how the painting paints itself, because what you're doing is you're letting water react with the dark pigment, and things occur slowly. They don't happen instantaneously, and you have to be willing to kind of roll with it. When you see something happen, incorporate that into your design. It may not be what you envisioned initially, but I'm getting some beautiful little blooms in this background here that kind of look like vegetation off in the background. It's really quite nice. So I did manage to get my darkest darks right up around this horn, and that really cements where you look first, because that's your darkest dark next to your lightest light, which is the horn. And then as your background moves across from left to right, you can see everything's getting lighter and lighter in value. We'll come in with a little darker mid-tone warms in here, so that we have less value contrast on his rump and hindquarters and his, this side of the cattle. We want the greatest value contrast to be over in our center of interest, which are their heads. So there's a lot of, thought that goes into how to control where the viewer looks. We want the viewer to be looking where there's more contrast in value. We have more exciting things happening. As we get off the frame of our center of interest, we want less value contrast, less attention to it. It just becomes context to define the shape. All right, we basically laid in I'm sorry, I need to move this up. I didn't see that it was missing. You can see the foreground now has a very light, soft quality to it. Just that little bit of dark that we put in around his forelegs and a little bit of dark back here, it may be just enough to define the shadows and anchor the cattle to the terrain. We will come back in and put some more darks around these rocks over here. But I think we don't need to worry about that until we get closer to the end. I'm seeing that I'm losing the sheen now of this background over here on this side, right in here. I don't know if you can see it, but it's still wet, but it's losing its shine. And sometimes when that occurs, you can take a little bit of additional water and sprinkle in. You're going to get a more pronounced blooming with the sprinkle of water that drops in there. I really want everything in the background to be very kind of atmospheric, very loose, very interpretive. I don't want to have anything real detailed back there. I want the detail to be in the cattle, which will be in our foreground. So at this point, I'm going to continue drying my background because I want to start working on the cattle and maybe the middle ground, the pond of cool light value behind him. And I need this little background area to be kind of dry, particularly along the water line of that pond in the far distance. So I'm just getting a little bit of heat to this so we can get it going. Using a fairly, 1 inch flat, I'm going to pick up a little bit of probably cobalt blue. I'm going to clean part of my palette here so I have a place to really mix this up and not make it dirty. Let you come over and see what I'm doing here. I'm cleaning out a little spot here so that I get a really nice cool glaze to put behind this cattle. And I just pick up a little bit of cobalt blue. It doesn't have to be real. There's not a lot of mystery to this. It's just a nice little glaze. Keep adding a little bit of water to it so it's a nice light value mixture. And I'm just going to come down and just drop in some really pale, cool color in here. The cattle are going to be very warm in value, so I want to have a little bit of coolness in here to contrast with that. So that's why this is just a really light glaze, nothing too obvious, but it provides a nice contrast. And we'll just kind of drop this in. And because my board is elevated, this blue is going to run downhill. It'll get darker as it gets towards the near shoreline, closer to their feet. And I can actually take a little bit of ultramarine and just drop a little bit of that in some of the area down here. And then I'm just going to tip my board back and move it around and let this all kind of flow smoothly into those wet shapes. But they'll all end up kind of collecting right down nearest the viewer, where the viewer's nearby shore is. Now, again, I want to wick up some of this excess water so it doesn't pool and get too dark, but I definitely want it to be a little bit darker in that area. And I'll just tip it, let the water move the pigment around, and just keep it a nice smooth gradation. So it goes from really light in the far background to a little bit darker in the near ground. And now you can kind of see by the fact that I was able to move that around a little bit, we get a nice gradation. And I don't want to have a real hard line here drying. I'm just going to soften this in a few spots. We'll wick up any excess in there. There we go. All right. Now we'll come back in and put a few reflections in the water after that dries. But for now, we've just got a nice cool background. So we've got a very light valued cool in the middle ground. We got a dark valued cool in the far background upper part of the painting. And then this will get warmer as we finish the very bottom of the page. But now we've got a good surround around our subject. And as we finish this and giving our attention to the cattle, we'll get our backgrounds dry. And I'm just going to take my heat gun and make sure it's nice and settled. It doesn't have to be completely dry, but I just don't want it flowing right up into the cattle any more than necessary. Okay, so what do we do next? Let me make sure you can see everything. I'm back the camera up just a bit. Get kind of an overview of what we've got. We've spent a very short amount of time and defined our subject as a negative shape. The two cattle are defined by what's around and behind them. We've put just enough value in that we can see it. So now we have something to work with. Now we go to work. Next thing we're going to do is start putting in shadows, tones. We've got a light source that's kind of in the upper right shining on these cattle coming down from the upper right. So that means the left side of their heads are going to be a little bit more in shadow. The recesses into their ears are going to be darker. We're definitely going to be coming up underneath the shaggy coat or the top coat with some darks that are warm. And then as we get down into their belly, we'll lose definition. It'll get cooler and we'll just kind of start losing edges. Everything that I do in around their throat, their neck, their belly that's in shadow is going to be very wet. It's going to move pigment around much the same way I did with the background. We're going to let the water move the pigment. We're going to let some splashed in clean water create blooms and textures within this. And it all becomes very suggestive without really defining a lot of detail. The only detail I really want to define is up around the little shadows in the furry headdress and underneath the top coat around their flanks. That's where it gets defined. So that's kind of telling you where we're going to go with the next step on this thing. All right, so let's just use a kind of a round brush. Doesn't have to be anything special. I happen to use these Perla brushes that are synthetic. They're good work brushes. And I'm just going to start putting in a little bit of value, like burnt sienna, with a little bit of the yellow ochre mixed in, maybe a little bit of the ultramarine if I need to darken it. But we'll start with just creating a burnt sienna, which is a warm dark brown. Here, and you can see this is where I'm going with this, just to make a nice warm glaze for the shadow side of their faces. Take a little bit of this blue that's up here. I can add that in there. See how that just kind of neutralizes it? It's not quite as bright and circusy, but it still has a warmth to it and a mid-tone value. Coming back to our painting, we'll start off by just kind of coming in a few places around their nose and head. And I'm going to clean my brush and just take a little bit of a damp brush and gently feather that dark away so that it gets lighter and lighter as it emerges into the light. Got to come back and get just a touch darker around his nose and over on this side and up in. Take some of that ultramarine blue and mix it with that brown and get right up into some of the little crevices and the shadow points underneath that furry top coat. All of a sudden now the one side of the cattle's head is very much in shadow in here where the underneath. I'm going to do the same thing with the other guy. Take a little bit of this warm, dark burnt sienna blue mixture, and just on the left side of his head, add a little bit of dark. Clean my brush, rinse it out, wipe it off. It's just slightly damp. I take the tip of the brush and I just tickle that wet puddle of paint, and it just dilutes it and starts moving it across into the warm part of their face. I can always take a little bit more of the yellow ochre, add to that in there, but that's good. I'm going to take a little bit of the burnt sienna, add just a little bit more to the sides of their muzzle, and it just kind of anchors that muzzle, gives it a nice feel. I'll work with the far calf first with his ear. I want to get a really nice dark. So I'm going to take the staining royal blue and a little bit of burnt sienna, maybe quinacridone burnt orange, anything to give me a really warm dark that's got a little bit of orange cast to it, but it's really dark. And I want to come back in and just create that tunnel that goes back into their ear a little. And then clean my brush completely. Just rinse all the water off, wipe it off, and then do the same thing. You're just going to push that clean brush back up into that dark. Clean your brush again and push up into that dark space so that it gets darkest where it goes back up inside the ear. A little bit more blue right up in that little crevice there. And because that was so wet, it's bleeding right back into the area that I want to be a little lighter. We can do the same thing on the other side and just kind of define the bottom edge of the horns, clean your brush, and then just take a damp brush and push up into that dark. Keep wiping your brush clean, rinsing it, and get a little bit more dark in a couple spots here just to kind of define that dark inside their ear tunnel. This one over here is really getting kind of wet, so I'm just going to take a tissue and just kind of pick up some of that excess water. We'll get a little bit of burnt sienna and drop that in there. Now that side's dark enough. I want to take the tip of my brush now that it's clean and really dry the outer edge of that ear so it's got highlighted surface. I'll come in dark behind it after that dries. But for now, I want this outer edge to have a little bit of the lightest value. And I'll get more dark going up in here. A little bit more dark in there. All right. There we go. Now I'm going to take advantage of the dark that I have on my brush and come back in at the top of some of these underneath the shadow of their top knot. Call them the top knot. That's their shaggy top coat, their helmet, whatever you want to call it. But I'm actually dragging a damp brush across this pond blue, so it just has a soft edge to it as it comes down. So I'm going to do the same thing over here. I want to soften this a little bit as it comes in underneath his chin. He's got a little bit of a beard, and we'll just put some very diluted burnt sienna in that area. And then when I come back in and cut in underneath this, it'll show up as a kind of a lighter beard that's hanging off of his muzzle by the darks underneath. All right, that's coming together. Once this is dry, we can kind of attack or work on the shadow side of their helmet, whatever you call it. I'm going to get a very diluted, watered down burnt sienna and just start putting in a little bit of shadow color on this side. It's still the same light value, but it's not getting the direct light. So it starts to have a little bit of tone to it that gets a little less bright. Less bright means we're going to tone it down with a little burnt sienna. Still has that nice undertone of warmth, but it's working. Same with this guy's ear. I'm going to darken that a little bit, the negative shape on the top of his ear. Get a little bit more burnt sienna right on his top knot on the left side. There we go. All right, let's move to a different area. Let that dry. I like how this warmth around his muzzle with the burnt sienna makes that muzzle feel like it's closer. And then when I added a little bit of the blue up in here on that burnt sienna, it neutralized and it made this a little grayer. So it feels like the head is moving back away from us and the muzzle being a little warmer is moving towards us. Hopefully you can see that. Does that make sense? And I think it really creates a nice effect by just punching up that warmth of the burnt sienna as it gets closer out towards the muzzle. While we're talking about the muzzle, let's talk a little bit about what they look like. Let's go back to our photo reference. They've got kind of a little bit of a pink cast. There's still a negative shape at the top of their muzzle, but it's not white. So we need to kind of be aware of that. I'm going to pick up a little bit of hot pink, a little opera maybe, mix that with a little bit of burnt sienna maybe, and just kind of get the top of his muzzle just a little bit pink. And I can always get the rest of it done, darken as it goes back underneath towards his mouth. But the top part of his muzzle, I'm just dropping in a little bit of pink to warm it up. I think if you look on the screen, that helps. We'll try to do a little bit more pink while it's wet. There we go. Okay. I'm going to back that up. And we'll let that dry. And while that's drying, I'm going to go over and start working on his tail. Go back to our photo reference. We've got some nice shadowing coming in underneath the bottom underside of the tail. The upper side is very light. So we've got a progression of darks that make that tail structure feel cylindrical. So we need to probably get more of a mid-tone burnt sienna effect kind of on the middle part of the tail coming down. And while that's wet and a little bit warm, we'll start getting the left side of that a little darker. And then I'm going to get raw umber and ultramarine blue and burnt sienna mixed together. And we'll get the bottom part of his tail right up against that wet shape we just put in there. We're going to make it nice and dark. And that when it hits that wet shape, it just kind of bleeds up into that warm middle ground or middle tone. As I bring that down, I don't really want to define the whole end of the tail. And then I want to leave a little bit of a highlight at the top. So I clean my brush and I just kind of tickle that edge of the mid-tone that's in the middle of the cylinder there. And it leaves a nice soft edge, revealing the light hitting the top of his tailbone across the top. I'll zoom in here for you so you kind of see what we're doing. I'm dropped in some nice dark ultramarine and raw umber on the underside. And that really defines the shape. Maybe we got some little edge changes here where this fur creates a little ragged edge on his rump. And it just kind of runs right down into the background here. I'm just going to soften this and get it lighter and lighter, and just so it just kind of disappears. I don't even need to have a lot there. I can just kind of pick up some of that with a tissue. But I've allowed the light value that we put down initially to remain on the upper edge of this tail, and it just really defines it as light hitting it. So I'll just kind of take a clean brush and lift and restore some of that light that's along that edge. All right, we'll back up and think about how to handle the rest of him. Let's see. I think at this point, I always check to see how we're doing with the, how wet it is versus how dry it is. I want to come back to our little fellow in the background. And I think that's important to do next because he's less important than the one in the foreground. And I don't want to go back and paint him last and he'll end up being more important or being more defined. So I want to keep this guy pretty loose. So I'm just going to chop in some kind of mid-tone raw sienna, burnt sienna I meant. And he does have a little bit of white back there that's on his coat. But now I'm going to come back in with some darks. And this is just burnt sienna. It's much warmer and darker than the sunlight hitting his muzzle. And get underneath here a little bit. Now, rinse my brush and push a damp brush up into that burnt sienna so the damp surface of the paper grabs that pigment and starts moving it across the shape. And I want to kind of lose his definition into this guy, the foreground guy's throat color. So I just have to kind of very gently work this in. Once this is dry, I'm going to come in with some darker shadow colors, but I want to keep them fairly soft while it's wet. So I'm dropping in some more of that raw umber and ultramarine. Rinse my brush and just pull that damp down into his throat. He's got some pretty dark stuff down in the throat, but this is wet now. So I just dropped a chunk of burnt sienna into that wet area, and it just kind of diffuses, and it doesn't really give me too defined of a shape. And now I'm going to come back in and do a very light value kind of yellow ochre where his leg is, because I'm going to come back in and darken that. But the yellow ochre is the highlighted fur that's hanging down around his legs. We'll end up darkening this in a couple places, but for now, I just want it to be nice and soft. And if you look at the photo, the lighter bits of fur that are hanging down are what I'm painting now. And we'll have to come back in and drop in some darks as negative shapes to define this after this is dried. Okay. I forgot to bring my blue over. So we'll let that dry, and then I'll erase this dry line here. Can you see where the blue glaze dried and left a white shape here? I want that blue to flow right on through between and behind his legs. And if I have a hard line there, that's going to be confusing to the viewer. So the best way to handle that when that happens is you take a fairly stiff little brush like this, slightly damp, and you can come back in and you can kind of erase where that dried and just soften it a little bit. And then I can glaze back in. See how I just basically soften that? I'll take a tissue and wick up any moisture that's there. Now there's no hard line. I can glaze in some blue again and really soften that so you won't even notice it. But for now, I just got rid of that hard line. And we can now see the definition of this guy's beard that comes down in his chest. So he's got these big fatty tissues that hang down beneath their chest and their chin. We got to let the little guy dry. I want to add, while it's still a little wet, I'll add a little bit of ultramarine blue just in a couple of spots here. I want to just kind of get some really loose, soft shapes that are kind of linear, but not have a whole lot of definition. It just keeps everything fairly soft back there. All right, let's talk a little bit about coming in behind the big guy's ear. If you look at our reference, we've got a lot of dark back up underneath. Let me get down here so you can really see this. You see how this dark cuts in underneath his ear and makes the negative shape of the edge of his ear come forward. That's why we have to put that burnt sienna with a little bit of ultramarine right in that area to kind of define that. We'll even glaze over some of his really lightest area on his top fur just to make it tuck in behind the ear. So that's going to be real critical to making this head important. So we'll take a round brush, pick up a little bit of a glazed burnt sienna, and I want to just kind of come in underneath and around that ear shape, rinse my brush, and just feather that away. So it just kind of moves into his chest. But now we've just now defined the shape of that ear. I can take a little bit darker value and come in underneath here now. Because that's wet, it just immediately starts moving away from that edge and gives us a nice soft blending and softening. I'm going to now take my edge of my brush and really start filling in under his chin. this fatty area that's hanging down, and across his shoulder, just with a very light glaze of burnt sienna. And what I'm doing is I'm wetting this surface a little bit, and we'll start feeling a little bit of muscular shapes to this thing. But just by dropping in this value, we're adding definition. And underneath here, under his muzzle, I'm going to take a little bit of ultramarine and burnt sienna and mix up kind of a dark mixture and get right up in here while it's wet. And we're working basically wet and wet. And I want to really get a little cooler, a little darker. So I add a little bit more ultramarine and a little bit more burnt sienna, but a little drier application to drop in here behind his foreleg. And this really helps us see this kind of flabby thing that's hanging down. And it's all wet and wet. So we're making these really nice feathered shapes, and they're just kind of coming down in and around all this stuff that's hanging down. I want to get a little bit warmer right in here. And I think if I take a, what have I got? I got a little smaller tip of a brush here. It's a round. If I make it damp, I might be able to pick up some little linear lighter areas. I'm just lifting some of that wet right underneath his beard to make it feel like there's some nice lighter strings of fur hanging down. And maybe we'll come right across. I'm going to also take a clean water and come into this little space between the painted value and the edge, and just get some, by dropping some clean water in there, some of this pigment should start blooming and softening and creating a really nice little soft edge. I'm definitely going to need to be darker. So I'm going to come back in and add a little bit of dark pigment in a few spots here. Add a little bit more burnt sienna to that to warm it up in a couple spots. Look at that nice bloom that occurred there. I'm hesitant to kill that because it's beautiful. And if we can, those are the things that make it more impressionistic. So I'll go back to my brush and see if I can't drop in some more lighter lifts that kind of come down through this thing that create the impression of just highlighted fur that's in his coat. There you go. We'll leave that alone. This edge here, I want to really make sure is lifted and lighter. I'm going to take my elevation, the sponge out from underneath my board so it's flat, and I'm going to lift this lighter edge. And because it's damp, it should give me a nice feathered edge. I've got a hard edge on the left side, but I'm going to come back in with some darks when I do the little fellow behind, and that should really give us a nice little soft edge. All right, now we've got our forearm coming down, foreleg coming down on his knee. I'm going to add a little bit more brighter burnt sienna. See how this has got more ultramarine in it on his neck and then on his forearm to make it feel like it's closer to us. We use more pure burnt sienna. And then on the back side of his elbow, I'm just going to drag some of this ultramarine that's in my palette and mix it with some of the burnt sienna and get a little darker back in here behind his elbow. And then as I go up into his belly, I want this to be darker. There we go. we've now already established kind of a base coat for the shadow behind his elbow. And always come back in and darken it later, but it's good to get it started initially. Now, as we move down towards his belly, we want to get a little warmer, a little wetter, a little darker in value. So I'm just going to take a burnt sienna on a wet brush, nice mixture, and pull this in here. And then while that's wet, get a little bit more of the ultramarine, and we'll drop that in right behind his elbow, down along the bottom side of his belly. And then I want to just kind of soften the edge at the top with just water so that it really doesn't give me a hard edge or hard line. And I'll tuck this back towards his flanks, and we'll start getting darker again where it tucks in behind his hind leg. And that belly is really in a cooler shadow at this point back in here. I'll get some burnt sienna right up to this part of his belly. Add water. I'm just taking a damp brush now and kind of pulling down this leg, which is going to get a lot of sunlight over here on the back side of it. The front side of it, I'm going to add a little yellow ochre to the burnt sienna mixture. And that rear leg that's on the far side, I'm just going to take more of that same ultramarine mixture and pull that right on down. And then as it gets closer to the ground, we're going to see more sunlight hitting it. So I'm just going to add in some more burnt sienna, clean my brush, and just feather away the bottom of that leg where it disappears into the grass. I'll just pull some of that burnt sienna right into the grass. And then we've got a nice warm termination of the leg down here near the foreleg. And then again, it just kind of disappears into the grass and we lose a lot of that definition. So I'm just going to take my brush that's slightly damp and just kind of feather that away. Now, I don't want this to dry up here, so I'm going to continue softening these edges so that they kind of work their way back up towards his top coat. I can take, while this is wet, I can put a little bit of shadow, very subtle, right in here behind his hip bone. Maybe a little bit of ultramarine in a couple places. More of the warm mixture of the burnt sienna as we wrap down towards his flank, or his kind of his muscles on his back. I'm going to take a clean brush and just soften those marks, leave a few hard marks in there with that color, so that all of a sudden now we've got some nice warmth that's not real regular. It's just kind of spots here and there. And we feel like he's got kind of a shaggy coat just by not being too careful with our brushwork. I'm starting to move up into this coat here where I'm getting a few little darks that tuck in underneath that other coat. And we'll come back and work with that. But if you lay a brush mark down, be sure you feather it back into the chest area or the rib cage area so that it doesn't become too predictable. Let's get a little bit more red, burnt sienna, right in this little muscular hip bone area. I like the fact that we're using ultramarine and burnt sienna, because what that does, those are sedimentary colors. They're going to granulate. They're going to give us a little bit more texture, which is ideal for trying to define or suggest that it's fur. If we use a staining color, these would all be really a very smooth, glowing color, and we wouldn't feel like there's texture to it. So it makes it work better if we use a sedimentary colors. If you left a few little whites in a few places and they dry, we'll glaze over those. You'll still see them, but it'll just add that much more texture to their coat, making it kind of a nice feeling. All right, time to step back, take stock of what we've done. I'll let you kind of keep working on this, but at some point I want you to kind of rock back a little bit in your chair or stand up and evaluate what's going on, because we're not dark enough yet. We just laid down the initial underpainting for the cattle, but you have to make sure you've got things defined in the right appropriate way. Now, for instance, this guy's neck here, it is the same value as the one behind. So we have to do some things with the guy behind. But before we do, I want to highlight the little glow you get along the edge of this guy's, the fur that's hanging down off his neck. Again, I'm going to take a clean brush. It's my little flat, and I can come back in and I can lift just a little bit of that lighter value right along that edge of his neck, which helps us see that. Now we can kind of see the shape of that kind of fatty neck muscle hanging down. Now when I come in behind the guy behind with kind of a wet, darker value, this will come forward. The neck will come forward, even though we're going to come back in and put more darks in underneath his muzzle. So in line with that, let's do that. Let's talk about that. We're going to take a little bit of ultramarine, and we're going to take some burnt sienna, and I really want to get this nice and dark. It needs to be cooler, so I'm going to add more ultramarine to my mixture. It looks like my paint got a little heavy while we were waiting, so I'm going to take a clean brush and kind of lighten some of this. It got on there a little heavy. And I want to add, back to what we were talking about, I want to get this a little cooler. So I'm adding in this wet area ultramarine and letting it spread around and granulate into this wet burnt sienna shape. And now we get these really nice results where you mix the warms and the cools. I think that helps. Let me go back with a clean brush now and soften this so we get a softer transition onto his shoulder. And I want to warm that up because it comes closer to us. His shoulder is closer than his neck, so we've got to get warmer. And that's all I'm doing, is just trying to warm up as the contour of his shoulder gets closer to us than his neck. I think that works. Okay, there we go. And I'm not trying to paint up too much into his upper neck area behind his ear, because we want to leave the highlights so we can come in with some really, crisp darks that define the fur. All right, so apologize for that, but I'm going to go in behind his elbow now and do the same thing. We're going to take this same cooler pigment and just get right up in there underneath his belly. Add a little bit of burnt sienna to that to warm it up. And as we start moving down towards his belly, this is all really dark. And I want to add some water to this and just really give it an opportunity to actually get some blooms. We want to try to drop a little bit of water in, and I'll take my rigger and drop some droplets of water into this rich sedimentary pigment. Get a little bit more of the ultramarine in there to really make sure that this gets dark as it goes down into his belly and his under his flank. And then this goes right into that other leg. And now, as it kind of emerges back around his rib cage, we get more burnt sienna, which is warmer. The warm comes towards us, the cool recedes underneath. And then I'll take my little rigger and just tap or tip or, sprinkle a little bit of water in there. And that should really give us some nice blooms underneath him, maybe some bigger droplets of water, and then just soften the transition of his legs and up into his hip there. But this is going to give us a lot of texture underneath his belly, which I think is needed. And then I'll soften the down under his leg, the far leg that's in shadow, that we can't really see that well. It's actually pretty dark. So I want to get even darker than what we've got back up in there to really make it feel like it's recessed back behind him a little bit. That helps really define it. Where, light and dark values are really what gives us the impression of what's near or what's far. If you have a cool dark, it recedes. If you have a warm dark, it comes towards us. And that's what we're doing with all these little subtle contours of this body. The things that are in shadow under his neck, they're farther away than the shoulder that's nearer us. So this has to be warmer. The neck has to be cooler. Underneath his flank and his far leg has to be darker. But then as the belly transitions up into the rib cage, it's more into the light. We start to feel more of the transition. And I hope you can see that by using the sedimentary colors of a burnt sienna and an ultramarine blue, we're really being able to create some nice, interesting textures as they start blooming and as sprinkles of water start reacting with the darks. We get kind of a fun suggestion of his furry coat. Now, over here on this rump side, he's got a whole series of linear things with his fur. So I'm just going to take a little squirt bottle and soften each one of these things. Let the water kind of move that around a little bit. Pull some of it down into his lower leg. But that's working. All right, we'll let that go. We'll let that kind of do its thing. Drop a few more drops of water in there and see what happens. Let's talk about our little friend behind. He's going to be a little less defined. He's going to be a little cooler overall than what we've got going here. So maybe a little bit of cobalt mixed in there in some of those darker areas. We'll get some, right? We're going to leave a little bit of light between him and the neck muscle of the guy in the foreground. But this is a cobalt glaze that I'm using right now, and I'm going to add just a little bit of burnt sienna to it so that we can get a few little tight little darks up underneath his muzzle and up underneath here. And then we've got a little bit more of this coming down. Get more of cobalt. And again, cobalt is also a sedimentary color. It's a natural earth mineral. So it's going to granulate. It's going to not be real staining. It's going to keep us pretty light in value. He's got one leg that's totally in shadow that has to be darker than this other guy in the foreground. So I'm using some pure ultramarine blue and letting that transition into the warmer leg, which is burnt sienna. But these are darker values. And then behind him, his little belly is just kind of barely there. Got some legs that are coming down, but part of that leg is really in shadow. The bottom of this leg and the front of this arm is in shadow. So that works. I'm not really trying to define this guy too carefully. I will put a little bit of ultramarine glaze on the bottom edge of his belly where the fur kind of goes into shadow. And I may be able to just take a dry brush and just kind of pull some of that down. Let's see if we can't get that a little cooler. There we go. And I'm going to pick up a little bit of this intense color here. And then see if we can't get some of this beard color to come into the lake just as loose. There we go. Now I'm going to have to go back and darken the guy in the foreground. So the big guy, we'll get his neck a little cooler, a little darker. Just want to get this a little more defined in here so it really comes forward. We'll add a little bit of burnt sienna to that. And we'll see if we can't pick up a little string of we'll see what happens. Where's my all right, let's look at their heads now. We need to get more value into their shadows of their heads. This guy's ear needs to be a little darker. Now that the paper's dry, we can go back in and really punch that up. This little side of his head needs to be darker. Gonna come up in there. I'm going to clean my brush now, wipe it off so it's just blotted, and then take that pigment I just put on there and just kind of get the right side of his head a little more in shadow. Same with the tunnel inside his ear. Just get a gradation within that small shape. Same with this guy. We need the big guy. We need to get some more ultramarine and burnt sienna to get a little darker up inside his ear. Just to really get those little power points of dark going. Let's see if I can't get a little bit of burnt sienna in there. And then I think now we can start putting a few little darks along this edge to create the jagged edge, the transition between the furry top coat and his regular all-season fur. Like how I make these terms up. By pushing those darks into these little jagged edges of fur, we're creating a negative shape. And you are going to kind of invent this because nobody's going to be able to get it absolutely photographic. So this becomes your painter's opportunity to kind of design. Try to always avoid repetition. Try to not repeat the same mark. If you got something going, abandon it when you go to the next place and do something different. But try to keep this very random as a look, and then emerge down into the warm. You know, these darks are just the top part of a little bit of a shadow in there. So you want to try to feather those away, transition them into maybe a yellow ochre or a burnt sienna, and then feather that back into the rest of their body. Well, we don't want to have a lot of obvious, fur here. So we're going to just pull some of this stuff up into this part of his body. Even his back has a little bit more of an orange cast. So I'm going to take a little bit of orange paint and just kind of glaze over part of this back here so that it's not quite as severe of a value contrast as up on his shoulder. We'll still be able to come back and do a lot of stuff with this, but we're trying to leave our brightest area right here on his shoulder and above his head. So again, we'll let that dry, and while we do that, we'll go back into this guy's head. I'm trying not to touch the painting with my hand, but I've got to control the tip of my brush by getting some darks in here. Clean my brush, and then push a clean brush into those little deposits of pigment that are wet, and it'll give me a nice soft gradation and blend down into his shadow shapes of his face. I want to get a little cooler back in here, so I'm just introducing a little bit more of the ultramarine, and I think that works pretty well. Now he's got more cool shadow over in here that we need to really kind of push up. There we go. And I'm going to get a few little darks right up in here. Okay, that work? Let's warm up this right in here. All right. Now he's on his upper shoulder flank. He's got a lot more warmth here, and our painting has dried very cool. So I'm just dropping in some burnt sienna just to warm up beneath that little kind of top coat area. And we'll get this all kind of worked in here. I want to get a really nice dark in here, right beneath his ear. There we go. This, while I'm letting that dry, I'm going to shift over here to his rear leg and try to get a little bit more of a transition to the fur. He's got kind of a definite divot in his elbow back in here. What else we got? I want to get a little bit of orange. I'm using my transparent orange and kind of water it down a little bit. I'm going to pull some of this in here like so. And then take a clean brush and just kind of leave some of it strong, leave some of it just barely there. And maybe right up in here, we'll get a little more dry brush. Pushing this dry brush into the white paper. A lot of this is done in layers. You've got to let different things dry so we can see the edge of some of these brush strokes when we glaze over them. And if you let it completely dry and you start laying in more layers of very subtle textural effects, you're going to really start seeing a lot of depth in his fur, and it's going to start feeling like fur. Right now we've got the values correct. Now we need to start working on some of the little textures to really make it feel right. So it's pretty dry. I'm going to come back in and just start putting in a little bit of this, some of this linear stuff, just with the edge of this brush that has some kind of ragged edges to it. That works. Now, let's get a little bit more red on the top of his tail. I'm going to just drop in a little bit of orange there. There we go. And then also, we want to get a little bit more orange up in his top knot, his helmet. That by preserving that negative shape, we still see it as a negative shape, but now we've got just a little bit more warmth to it. And I think that really helps create the impression we're after. I want to get a little separation between his horns and There we go. Now, while we're letting all that dry, before we go back in and finish the furs, he's got these horns have a cylindrical shape to them. So let's take a little bit of orange and come down the middle of these in a couple of spots. Maybe a little bit of red up here on this guy. And then clean our brush and get a little bit of ultramarine, just a very small amount, and come down on the back side of this thing. So it almost feels like a bit of a shadow. Same up here. We're going to add a little bit of ultramarine to this part of his horn. And then on the underside here that's in shadow, we'll take the raw sienna, the burnt sienna and the ultramarine, and we'll come in and make this a little darker than his back fur. And that just creates the horn in shadow. And then we can take orange again and come right in underneath this guy. So now all of a sudden the horns actually have some nice color, albeit very subtle. I'm going to take a little bit of green and drop a little green in here too, just for the heck of it, just to make them a little different. And I can always take a clean brush, get all the water, all the paint off of it, and go back in and soften any lines so we get a nice gradation curling around that horn. But it still needs to be a bit darker. So I'm going to try to get a very soft, slight bit of blue in here to make this bottom part of the horn a little darker. And this guy coming up through the middle has a little bit of dark. There's just a little bit of light tickling this thing that tells us that it's, there we go. Always use a round brush that's clean and just slightly damp to smooth out or feather an edge of pigment that's starting to dry. And you can really create a nice gradation and soften things perfectly. Okay, now let's go back and take another look at our friends and kind of see what we need to do. What do we need to do to make this feel about right? His muzzle needs to be a little bit grayer. So I'm going to take some of the cool blue and a little bit of Payne's gray. And I've got a little bit of the pink. Let's see, I'm just kind of playing in my palette here, mixing up, whatever might give me a kind of a dirty pink with a touch of gray to it. There we go. That might be the good part to put on the underside of his muzzle. And it comes up kind of in a inverted V. Same with the little guy behind, more of a straight shot across. And we'll put the nostrils in once everything's really dry, and we'll put some real crisp darks in there. We can come back in now at this point and start putting in some true darks. I'm going to use the royal blue that I used and a little bit of quinacridone burnt orange or alizarin, something that's going to be a red and a blue mixture to give us a black. And I'm going to really kind of push in a couple of real strong darks in a few spots here to really define a couple of these little shadowy areas inside his top knot that's in shadow. I'm going to clean my brush, get all the water off of it, and push a clean, damp brush into those little shadow shapes so that they don't really just end. They just start gradually emerging from that really light area. And I think that helps really define the shape of their heads too. All right, remember I said I was going to do something with this water. I'm just going to take a little bit of cool cobalt. And I'll just feather that in there. Now you don't even notice it. And we talked a little bit about putting in a shadow or a reflection in the water. I'm going to take a little bit of iridium, a little bit of the royal blue, maybe a little sap green. So it's a deep, dark blue-green. And I'll come back in and just kind of create a couple of little shapes in here. And then clean my brush and push a little bit of water up towards those little shapes of dark that are reflections in the water. And as I push up, it filters the pigment down. It gets lighter and lighter as it comes forward. So it just sort of feels like a little bit of definition there. I'm going to take a little bit of the same color, and I might create a little bit of a shoreline back here. Maybe do the same thing, but less defined, a little bit of gradation. There we go. Not much. Maybe take some raw umber. All right, that's good. Now, while we're letting this dry, I want this to really dry. My paper is very wet. It's all bowed up. So I'm going to work on the foreground, and we'll take a blending brush. I have this kind of a long, feathery, whisk broom type brush. And I'm going to get a little bit of leaf green. First of all, I got to get just a little bit of moisture on it, not much. And I want to try to get the foreground maybe a little bit warmer as we come towards the viewer. I'm going to add just a little bit more warmth, a little bit more green in here. Get a little bit greener. Maybe this whole corner needs to be greener. And then I'll just drop in a little bit of the damp brush into those areas so that they really don't tell us too much. They just suggest that there's some vegetation in there. And maybe I take a little bit of the quinacridone burnt orange and I drop that in a couple spots so it just warms it up. Get this little pinker with that quin burnt orange. Very, very loose. You can even do this. You can take a little misting bottle and just very gently mist a couple of these things, and you'll just get that edge to just sort of run across the surface of the paper without giving any real definition to it. It's just a bit of movement of shape in there that's kind of pleasant. I do want to get a dry bit of dark in those rocks. So I'm going to take this short brush that I use to kind of erase things, and it's slightly damp, just very slightly damp. And I'll dip it into a little bit of the raw umber, a little bit of the ultramarine. And I'm just going to kind of pop a little bit of that dark in there to suggest that there's something going on with the got to get enough dry paint on there. If you can't get any dry paint on there, it's not going to do the trick for you. And I'm trying to use the raw umber as opposed to burnt sienna because it's a little less, dark. It's just more of a neutral color. There's a little bit of ultramarine in there, and that is, I don't want to take away attention, but I thought just getting a little bit of darks in here kind of reestablishes the shadowy effect that we're trying to get. And I take this brush that's a kind of a blending brush, squeeze all the water out of it, and just very gently touch some of these little blue things with the edge of that brush and pull it up. And it gives you kind of a jagged edge like vegetation. And it just suggests that that's where the shadows are underneath the beast. And I like that. I think that's working. Yeah, there we go. All right, now we need to kind of come back and take a look at our fur. And I think I need to dry this some more. It's still pretty darn wet. So that tells you how much water I was using. I've got to get this drier before we go too far. And I think I need to get this guy's ear to recede back. So what we'll do is we'll take our small brush and this little round brush. Let me get this squared away in here for you. All right. And I want to get a glaze of some kind going in behind there with this guy's. So he basically disappears or is receding behind our friend in the foreground. And I want to get a little darker right behind his nose. Okay. And I think we can take some ultramarine and very wet, and we can now put a few little striations in behind. And I'm going to take a little bit of the royal blue and mix it with the quinacridone burnt orange and really start popping in some darks underneath this guy's chin. Drag that around to this side a little bit. Push that brush towards some of these guys, soften some of these edges so that they kind of get lost in shadow. And then go back to this dark pigment that I was using and maybe get a couple more of these little striations coming down off of his coat. Get some burnt sienna, warm parts of this up a little bit. Feather that away so it just starts gradating down into the light. He's got a shadow in his hip that needs to be warmer. So I'm just going to start throwing in a little bit of shape there, softening it with water, and down into his belly. Still, he's got the suggestion of some fur shapes coming in. He's got a little highlight across his flank here, and just above it, it's a little darker. So I'm going to see if I can't just soften this a little bit and give us a bit of a highlight, and then gets darker down in here as it gets down into this leg. Yeah, take a tissue and just kind of pick some of that up, and you really feel like that has a little bit of musculature there. And we need more blue. as this dries, we're losing the shadow behind his elbow. And again, I'm working with ultramarine and a little bit of cobalt. And then coming back in with some of the quinacridone burnt orange. Now that quinacridone burnt orange is a highly staining color. Everything before this has been all sedimentary to give us texture. Now we're just trying to take it down to a really darker stained color and to really create that value contrast as it tucks down underneath his belly. So I'm really trying to get this nice and dark. Add a little bit more of the cool blues in there. See what we can do with a little bit of water. You can see if that blow on it a little bit and it'll move the brush marks around because it's all wet and wet. And I'm just softening some of the edges there. But I like how dark that is now. And a lot of those sedimentary colors will dry very light. Whereas if you use a staining color like the Prussian blue or the royal blue, these darker blue colors that we suggested, it's going to stay dark. The same with quinacridone burnt orange. It's going to stay very dark because it's a staining, transparent color. And you'll see a lot of the texture right through that staining color that had already dried. And you'll never lose that. But by glazing over this with the darker color, it really takes it down to a nice value, which makes more sense. Now his foreleg is a little bit too light. So on the front end of that, I'm going to take a wet brush with quinacridone burnt orange, and I want to get this front part of his leg a little bit warmer. And then add a little bit of blue through here. And then go back to a warmer color down at the bottom. Needs to be warmer. There we go. Now that leg is closer to us than the ones behind because it's so bright and so warm, and it has some nice brightness to it. I think we could probably use a little bit of that same color right in this little divot in his elbow. I want to get this dried very light, so I'm going to come back in with a little bit more cool color and get his rear leg just a little bit darker. And then it goes into a warmer color. There we go. Starting to have some dimension. I think this needs more shadow. A lot of it is working your way through these as the paint dries, it lightens. And you have to work with it and watch your painting as you develop it to get it to the right value. And I'm just trying to get this back shadowy area warm enough. There we go. He's got some ribs in here that are pretty dark. I think he's starting to have some fur. It actually reads pretty well. And there's a lot of variety to it. I'm just taking a dry brush now and kind of dragging a little bit of tone across the bottom edge of some of these negative shapes, just to make them feel a little less obvious. There. A lot of it is about using some dry brush. All right, let's talk about nostrils. They need to be done with a pretty small brush. I have a little calligraphy brush that's really a fine point, and you wet it. I mean, you can see there's hardly any tip to it there. I think you can see, gives that lighter background. I'm going to pick up some neutral tint or else some Payne's gray, a little bit of that kind of Prussian blue, royal blue, and a little bit of quinacridone orange. So it's got some life to it. It's not just a flat black. But I'm going to kind of tuck in underneath the slant of his nostrils with some nice dark. Get that in there. Sometimes you have to get a little bit more wet on your brush to get it to come off. I think that does it. You can almost do a little bit of a dry brush with this type of a brush and get a few of these little stringy things that are coming down through his coat. But be careful about repetition. If you do too much of it, it can feel a little bit overworked. So I'm just trying to maybe glaze over some of this stuff that's not as important. And I want to get a little bit of orange on his rump here. Soften that, blend it around. Add a little bit to his tail. I think it's working. Let's get a little bit more brown right up underneath his nose, behind his nose there. Clean your brush and then kind of filter that back. It defines the muzzle just by having some dark up against that pink. And then the underside, just go a little cooler. Let's see if we can soften that. I think that's it. Now, we talked a little bit about breaking up his back spine a little bit. I'm going to take a round brush. It's slightly damp, it's clean. And I'm going to take and just erase. It won't completely erase, but it'll soften or break up part of that backbone. And I had a couple places where I had some divots in as I came across with the dark green background. I'm just simply trying to pull some of that warmth up into the back and just eliminate. And it makes the background a little smokier or a little mistier or something. It's kind of like just a softening an edge. It's all we're trying to do is so it isn't all predictable. We see a couple of really strong edges. I'm going to come back in with some sap green and some royal blue. And I might come in and just really punch up a little bit of dark, clean my brush really well, and then just soften this back up into the background. But look how that just really makes a couple of these things really pop. I'm going to come in right behind his horn with a little bit of dark. These are like little power points of dark that just suggest, oh yeah, wow, it makes it stand out. And I don't want to lose all that nice texture that I've got, but I'm in a couple places, I'll come back in and really punch up just a little bit of detail. And I might take some Viridian or some other color and just pull that away into the background and soften it a bit so that basically I'm just really making our attention go right to these guys, and it just makes them really important. I think what I'm going to do is take some of that dark and pull right up into his ear and then take a tissue and soften it a little bit. Over on this ear, I want that background to be just a little darker behind it. So I'm going to come back in and around like this, clean my brush, and then just soften that. And it doesn't change the painting, but it makes that ear stand out as closer to us than what's behind. And I can take just a touch of ultramarine to my quinacridone burnt umber and get right underneath that horn and in a couple of spots, clean my brush, and it just adds a little bit of variety to the background, but it makes his head feel like it's turned more towards us, and it makes more sense. Might try to come back in with a little bit of dark for our friend in the background. Not sure if that's going to do it or not, but we'll try. All I'm doing is making the big guy's head come forward a little bit. I think these are a little bit too predictable, so I'm going to come down and probably try to eliminate some of them so that it isn't quite so much the same. I want to give it a little more variety. All right, I think that's it. Now, this the little guy in the background, I want to get him a little cooler. He's back there, but the guy in front is darker and stronger subject as a positive shape, and it just reads better. I want to get a little brighter on his foreleg. Clean my brush and just soften the back end of this so that it feels like he's got a little bit of light on the back side of his leg because of our light source coming from the upper right. And I think there you can see how it's nice to have just a little bit more warmth there. I'm going to take a little stronger value coming down the shadow side of the front. Excuse me. All right. I think we need a little bit more of a reflection behind this guy on the left. So I'm going to get a little bit more meridian, a little sap green, a little bit of the colors over here, and just add that in there, and then just push that with some water, and then possibly take a little dark. All right, let's put some vegetation, something possibly in the behind these rocks here. We can come back in with a little bit of orange. And then I would take a kind of a dry brush, this little flat brush, see if we can't get some burnt sienna on it, and put a little bit of something in there, and then pull some of that up into the terrain. Just a little extra texture there. I think that works. A little bit of green. I've got this leaf green by Holbein that works pretty well. It's like an apple green. It's really light, but it takes us back and forth between the warmth of the burnt sienna and the coolness of the green to give a variety. Try a little bit of darks over in here too. All right. I think it's kind of a fun painting. Let me get the camera back a little bit so you can see the whole thing. What do you think? We there? I think we're there. I want to get maybe the underside of him a little cooler but nothing too defined. So I'm thinking taking a little bit of ultramarine and maybe let's take a soft brush that's squeezed all the water out of it, and then just kind of soften this. You never know. I think that makes it less defined back there. Works for me. Keeps it softer. I like the softer effect underneath. It keeps our attention up on his flank and his head, and not so much down here in the. And do a little bit of blue in here, maybe. Yeah, I like that. Softer. Maybe get a little darker right in here. Clean my brush, get all that pigment off, all the water out of it, and just use it to kind of blend it up into the water. Yeah. Now there's some depth there. We don't really see the guy behind so much. We just see little bits of light on him and a little bit of a subtle shape, but it works. And then we can take this brush I was just using, that is short, flat brush for lifting or blending, and I can come back in and I can kind of soften part of this guy, get a tissue and kind of pick up a little bit of that damp. But I like how that just kind of softens and picks up a little bit of light in that flabby stuff that's hanging down. Yeah, it's working. What do you think? So we call it, I think that's it. I like how this is really bright. His head's well defined. This is just suggestive back here of somebody peeking around the corner. The background is a device to set off the head, and it's darkest and coolest over here behind the head. And then as we move to the right, everything gets a little less intense, less saturated in value, moving more towards a cool mid-tone. But it still defines the overall shape of the Highlander cattle. The biggest definition is right in where we cut in around the raggedy top coat of his fur. But we've managed to kind of define where the hip bones are, the flank, the shadows from the underside of the back legs. The foreground is very soft. We haven't really defined anything. And yet it's warm, so it comes towards us, warmer even than the cattle. It's got these little highlights where sunlight is hitting some of the terrain. Underneath the cattle, we've grounded them by putting in some suggestions of shadow within the vegetation. And we kept the middle ground right behind them, a very cool, barely there blue that sets off the warmth of the cattle. So I think all in all, it's a pretty good representation of what we're trying to achieve. If you start getting too many dry areas where it dries in their ear, you can always take a brush and just kind of soften an edge. I think I've shown you all now enough times how to soften an edge. Make sure you use a brush that's clean, that you don't have a lot of pigment sitting on it before you touch it. But you can always go back in and soften an edge very gently, and it just does wonders in creating the nice change. I like the fact that we had a little bit warmer muzzle. That's too much. So I'll come back in and push some of that towards the muzzle, but it makes that head come towards us. Put a little bit of the birdseed in this area that we just lifted. But I think we're done.